Welcome to another edition of Global Conversations. You know, with everything that's happening in my part of the world, which is the Russian Federation, and everything that's happening in Ukraine and the four independent republics that have voted overwhelmingly to return to Russia, the implications of President Putin sending another 300,000 into Ukraine are very important. But tonight, another very important topic for everybody, not only in the United States, but around the world. We are going to be discussing the COVID challenge. We're going to be discussing alternative holistic medicine practices, something that I have been very much interested in for more than 20 years. And we are going to be discussing the medical industrial complex. My guests tonight are Dr. Andrew Kaufman, MD, Dr. Dom Cowan, also an MD, both in the United States, and Dr. Kevin Corbett, a PhD from London, England. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks, Regis. Great to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you. And the discussion that we will have tonight, to me, and not only to me, but I think everybody, is going to be very important. So I'm going to begin with Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Andrew, tell me a little bit about your background. You have been involved in alternative medicine for a very long time. You were a COVID-19 whistleblower. And I want you to be able to explain to my viewers briefly your background and your credentials. Andrew, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Regis. And I am definitely a big proponent and student of natural healing, but it actually hasn't been that long, about 5 years. So I have quite an interesting background as it portends to the current situation. I started off with my undergrad in biology at MIT, and I worked in the biotech industry in molecular modeling and then in manufacturing and quality control. Then I worked in public health for a couple of years in a CDC-sponsored position doing AIDS surveillance. Went back to school, became a physician assistant, worked in hematology and oncology and bone marrow transplant, then went to medical school, did my residency in psychiatry at Duke, then did a fellowship in forensic psychiatry, where I joined the faculty up at Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, transitioned to private practice over time, but always worked with a forensic population. And then that's when I began really studying and experimenting with natural healing. And eventually, in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I left organized medicine and began doing education and consulting in natural healing and, of course, in debunking the official COVID narrative.
Well, terrific. It's obviously going to be very interesting and important discussion. Dr. Tom Cowan, a little bit about your background.
Okay, thanks, Regis. I have a little bit of a different story. I grew up in a pretty much all my parents' friends were doctors. My father was a dentist. My grandfather was a dentist. And it was expected that I would become a doctor as well. I was good in school. However, I didn't like it, and I didn't know why. Something about medicine just didn't sit right. So I went to college and tried to do anything but be a doctor. And then I joined the Peace Corps and taught gardening for 2 years in Swaziland. And while there, I actually met the work of Weston Price and some others. And what I realized was that the kind of doctor that I didn't want to be was not the only kind of doctor there was. That allowed me to then study medicine and go to medical school with the idea that as soon as I could, I would set up my own, I was going to figure out how science, biology, and medicine worked. And because of that, I would be able to help people with serious illness. So I went to medical school, did an internship, and then I quit my residency because I had enough. And so then in 1984, I set up my private practice and worked as an ER physician part-time for about 10 years. And I have been ever since then trying to figure out how this all really works. As a result, I wrote books saying that the heart doesn't pump the blood. There's a whole different reason why the blood moves, that blocked arteries are not the main cause or even the usual cause of heart attacks. Cancer has nothing to do with genetics. Vaccines make people sick. And then finally, the proof that viruses, you can't prove it negative, but showing that there is no evidence that anything called a pathogenic virus actually exists. So that's what I've been doing along with my private practice, which I then retired from for about 2 years ago because I was unable to continue to be working in the medical system 2 years ago.
Wow. Incredible background and a wonderful story. My own personal experience goes back some 20 or 25 years ago with a very dear friend of mine who was a mentor at Arizona State University. This was when I was living in Phoenix, Arizona. And he was one of the first people in a university, a major university, to promote and establish a program at ASU in alternative holistic medicine. And so I've been really interested in this for a very long time. Well, now we're going to go to Kevin Corbett in London. Kevin, take it away, a little bit about your background.
My background, I'm a registered nurse in the 1980s and worked in acute medical and surgical services and intensive care, in intensive therapy units, we call them in the UK, and then went to work in HIV and AIDS. Before I trained as a nurse, I did a training as an artist. So I did an undergraduate and postgraduate degree in fine art. And that's always been a since. But my nurse training and my nursing professional experience took me into HIV and AIDS in the mid-1980s when this first became a specialty. And I worked within the orthodox services, within the orthodox model of viruses and allopathic medicine until the mid-1990s. And I struggled in that field, particularly with HIV and AIDS, because although I'd inculcated the orthodox model of bacteria and viruses, I struggled in that field because of the problems in that field, because of the approach was terminal, the approach was toxic, and the medical approach was very, very limited. So it wasn't until I started undertaking research training in the late 1980s, I went and I did a master's degree in nursing at King's College London, and I learned about research methods, and I became a nurse researcher. I was able to approach the whole field of HIV and AIDS in the 1990s in a different way. And I undertook a doctoral study in social sciences of people's experiences of the HIV antibody tests the ELISA and Western blot tests, and the polymerase chain reaction tests that then were coming in the mid-1990s. And so my whole approach then changed in terms of the understanding the difficulties I'd experienced as a practitioner were underpinned by major caveats in the science and the technology of HIV and AIDS. And that completely changed my mindset in orthodox allopathic approaches. And then I came out of that whole approach, that whole medical approach to AIDS in my HIV research. And that's where I sort of was stuck within the mainstream academic system that I was working in, because this is obviously a very controversial topic to question. And I moved then into other areas of nursing and healthcare research. But the common theme in my work has been patients' experiences, delay reception of biomedical knowledge. And that was the title of my thesis, my PhD thesis, which was called Contesting AIDS HIV, Delay Reception of Biomedical Knowledge. And that's the common theme throughout all my academic and my clinical work as a practitioner. And at the moment, I'm retired. I'm beyond the retirement age. I'm nearer 70 than 65. And so I'd hoped in the last few years to be able to have a slightly less frenetic professional life. But because with COVID and the pandemic, the last 2 years have been the most busiest period of time that I've had since I retired. And life has 2 years, because my PhD work was around PCR, I was able to find a group of people, group of scientists, and a group of lay citizen scientists that I'm now working with, moving forward with all these issues in a way that 25 years ago, when I started, 30 years ago nearly, when I started work on my PhD, I was on my own. I was very, very isolated. Now there's much more of a ground to build on and to work with than there was ever in the 1980s and 1990s with the HIV/AIDS dissidents. So this is a very positive period now for me to move forward with.
Well, thank you, Kevin. 3 very fascinating individuals with very, very interesting and important, inspiring backgrounds for many years in the study and research about modern medicine and healthcare. We're going to shift now to one of the things, maybe the thing that has brought all of you together. In fact, many, many people around the world, medical doctors, scientists, lab researchers, and even lay people, including somebody like me who has no understanding of the science or the medicine behind any of this. And the topic now is challenging COVID, the COVID narrative. Andy Kaufman, I'm going to begin with you. How did you gravitate towards challenging the virus narrative?
Well, Regis, it really was mostly a matter of curiosity. I was traveling in February of 2020 to the West Coast, and upon my return, I saw all these people wearing masks at the airport. And I had known that there were reports of, a mysterious or reportedly mysterious illness in Wuhan, China. So I began, looking into it, and I started at the very beginning, which is, where's the scientific paper where they discovered this virus that they're talking about in the news headlines. And once I read that paper, I was very confused because the experiment that they did didn't discover anything. They just kind of had a couple of patients. They didn't know what they had, but they did some test on them that was developed before they even discovered anything and said it meant something. And then they did a strange experiment where they took their body fluid and then mixed it with a tissue culture and put all these things in, and then saw some damage in the cell culture and said that that meant there was a virus. And I was really confused because that wouldn't be the science using the scientific method or the way that you would simply discover something in nature. You would just look for it in the place it was in nature and then get it in such a way that you could dissect it and do experiments on it. And they didn't do that. So, of course, that led me to then look at every thing subsequently through that lens, that they never actually proved this. So, for example, they had published a paper pretty early on saying that they satisfied Koch's postulates, for this alleged virus that I knew they hadn't even discovered. And then I was able to see how they didn't actually do the experiments that would test Koch's postulates. And even when they fudged it, their results, for example, like they gave this fluid from the cell culture to some experimental genetically modified mice, and the mice didn't even get sick from it. But they said it that they did, which was so strange. So this kind of led me to question a whole number of things about infectious disease and go back and look into germ theory as a whole subject and see what's the actual evidence. Because what most people don't realize is that when you go through all of the schooling of studying biology and physiology and microbiology, and then in medical school or whatever professional, if you go to nursing school, medical school, pharmacy school, dental school, any of these things, they're essentially teaching the same thing, which is they're just telling you that these diseases are caused by these germs, but they never go through the experimental evidence that established that. And so no one who practices these professions has ever looked at it. And this was me looking at it for the first time because I was concerned, people were behaving differently. So there must be something serious. I want to know about it. But when I went to look at that paper, I fully expected to just have that as a starting place. And then to, look at everything else, like look at, well, okay, what's this illness? Is it a new illness? What are the characteristics? How do I recognize it? How do we treat it? Because coming at it from a clinical perspective. And then I just happened to see that, it's not even something that they've even discovered for real.
Wow. For me, as a layman, I can say this is really mind-blowing because I don't have a medical background, but I suspected from day one, 1 week after I arrived in Russia, by the way, COVID burst on the scene. We were told it was a pandemic. I didn't believe it, Andy, because not of any medical background or science background, it just all of a sudden, globally, worldwide, this virus, they called it, happened all over the world. And almost immediately, almost every country in the world instituted the same measures to prevent it, to control it, whatever, that involved masks, PCR tests, lockdowns, mandatory vaccinations. And I thought to myself, I don't know that any cold or flu ever spread this way. And so I began to question it even then, refused to be vaccinated and never will. And so I've been really enthusiastic about hearing from people like yourselves with a medical background explaining what was really going on. It's been an incredible eye-opening experience for me, and I think for most of the people that view my shows. Dr. Tom Cowan, how did you arrive at this?
So I think the best argument I think I've ever heard in my life was, I believe it was 1986 or 87. I'm not sure. It was at a conference, and the one sort of alternative doctor that I really respected ended up in a public argument with probably the world's leading natural AIDS doctor. And this one doctor's name was Otto Wolf, raised his fists and said, "There's no such thing as a virus. All it is just poop coming out of the cells." And the other guy, of course, believed in HIV. And I knew at that point there was something really wrong with this whole virus narrative, but I didn't look into it. So I didn't look into it until I knew there was no HIV, and HIV had nothing to do with AIDS, but I still didn't really look into the whole theory until the alleged COVID thing. But I think, Regis, what I want to tell you is, and maybe your listeners, is you don't actually need any medical background to understand this at all. And if you give me a few minutes, I can tell you exactly why I say that. Because if I was to say to you, how do you know something exists and what it does? So let's take an example like a tree. How do you know there's a tree? So here's the steps. You make a definition of a tree. A tree has bark and branches and leaves and a trunk and roots. It lives in a forest. You can analyze it, and then it makes fruit, etc. And then you can go to the forest and see if you see a tree, and you can analyze the parts, and you can see what it does, and then everybody will know that such a thing as a tree exists. Here's what it's made of, and here's what it does. You can do the same thing if you say, do frogs exist? You make a definition of a frog. It's got 2 legs. It goes ribbit. It's got eyes. It eats flies, etc. You go to the natural habitat as a pond or a wetland. You go there. You find hundreds, thousands of frogs. If you're a mean person, you can kill the frog and analyze it and find out what it does, etc. You can do that with a bacteria. You make a definition of a bacteria, find out what its natural setting is. It's got some protein and some nucleic acid, and it's a unicellular thing. You can go to your mouth. You can go to a pond. You can go to any number of places, find the bacteria, analyze it, see what it does. That's how human beings, whether they're scientists, doctors, or lay people, understand whether something exists and what it's made of and how it does. Now, I'm going to tell you something which you may or may not know, and your listeners may or may not know. But if you do the same thing with a virus is a small particle. It has a protein code. It has some nucleic acid in the inside. It's self-replicating. It grows in biological tissues like lungs or kidneys or eyes. It grows in plants, animals, and as it grows, it destroys the cells and causes disease. So then you can go to the natural habitat of that alleged organism, like your lungs or your eyes or your ears or the brain tissue or whatever you say it lives. And it turns out there is not one published paper, not one in the history of science or medicine that can demonstrate that that particle that you just defined exists in any one of those tissues. Not one. Nobody has found any pathogenic virus, according to that definition, in any lung fluid, any snot, any type of biological fluid of any or tissues of any plant, animal, or human being. It doesn't take anybody with any training to understand that if you hear that, you should immediately think, this is crazy. How do they say that this thing exists? Now, the first thing you would say is, well, it turns out everybody agrees with this. If you ask every virologist, every medical doctor, the CDC, the NIH, is that true? We've never found this particle in any biological fluid. They say, yes, that's true. And you say, why not? They say, because there's not enough to find, which is a totally bizarre answer, because on the one hand, they say, like with COVID, with SARS-CoV-2 or HIV and AIDS, your lungs are teeming with viruses. And your lungs are the perfect culture medium for these so-called viruses. Yet, you can't find them. And so the way they find them, as Andy alluded to, is you take unpurified snot and you mix it in a test tube or a petri dish with a culture medium of, monkey kidney cells. And then when they break down, supposedly then you have enough to find. This is pure nonsense. And all you need to know is they've never found such a particle for rabies, chickenpox, HIV, Ebola, smallpox, COVID, for SARS-CoV-2 in any biological fluid of any sick person. They have a million excuses for why that is. But if I said, Regis, there's this thing called a tree and they live in the forest and you go to every place on earth and you never see a tree, you would never believe it. You would never believe it. And that's how delusional the world has become, because somehow we believe it, even though in any other context, we would say this can't possibly be true.
Wow. Tom, Andy, you got my attention. I have to agree. Even somebody like myself can understand exactly what you're saying.
Regis, let me say another thing. If they said, okay, you can't find the frog, here's how we're going to find the frog. We're going to take a sample of the pond water and we're going to mix it with some other things and we're going to find a piece of a tongue and we're going to say that tongue must have come from this new organism called a frugal, because it's, so you've never seen it before. All you have is some pond water. And you wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe it. That's how they found this virus.
You're killing me, Tom. Thank you so much for that. We're going to go to London now. And Kevin, how did you get involved in this?
Well, 2 years ago, I came into this COVID era of being aware that this whole debate around virology and HIV was my background. And I was aware that the PCR tests, what's called the PCR test, is not a diagnostic test. I was aware about the non-specificity of antibodies and the caveats over ELISA and Western blot tests. And therefore, I wasn't surprised 2 years ago about what happened. I've been following the 1980s, the 1990s. We'd had SARS, we'd had MERS, we'd had swine flu, we had BSE, we had all these plandemics, these pseudo-epidemics. And it was just the big one 2 years ago. It was incredible. And having been awarded a PhD on the basis of the PCR test not being a diagnostic, that's in my PhD, page 70, 71, my data. This was no surprise to me. What was interesting to me was the widespread plan, the uniformity and the homogeneity across all the countries. It was just the same with HIV, but smaller. nations did the same thing with HIV. They instituted testing, they introduced prophylaxis and toxic medications. So this was just the same for me, much bigger, much wider, more people involved, and therefore more people that have been sucked into these pseudo-epidemics, the more dissidence that's created. And therefore, my PhD came into its own. I was being asked to contribute. I took a very evidential approach to this, and I approached the Public Health England experts, the SAGE experts in the UK responsible for PCR testing for COVID, and I developed an audit trail demonstrating through my correspondence with them that they had no live virus, there was no isolated purified agent from patients on computer modeling, what's called in silico sequences that are developed through, assembled through computer programs, computer software. And I put this in the public domain, and I wrote several papers and self-published them in 2020. One asking for evidence of the novel coronavirus. I titled it, "Where is the evidence of the novel coronavirus?" And another paper of virology called the Anti-Coronavirus Toolkit, where people could read this paper and they could help deconstruct what the public health authorities were saying. And I also published my own third paper on the non-specificity of antibody testing for HIV, looking at the whole history of British regulation of that test. And I went out in public and I protested with activists across the UK, spoke at rallies. I developed a public campaign. I led a campaign of the UK in 2020 asking for evidence of the coronavirus. We never got a reply. And basically, I worked on lots of different levels, scientifically and as an activist across the UK. And I hope I'm still doing that. So that was my approach to that's how I arrived at this. And that's how I got involved in all this. And basically, it was an extension of what I've been doing for the best part of 30 years. It wasn't surprising to me that the antecedents for this in the last 25 years, they were collecting like clouds collecting for a storm. They were forming over the last 25 years.
Wow. Kevin and Tom and Andrew, I'm going to put your websites and work that you've done, and Kevin, the papers that you've published in the description to the show, so that people who are interested and want to do their own research, and that's the whole point to my particular show, Global Conversations, is to create a discussion and encourage people to do their own research on these very, very important issues. Now, one question, I'll begin with you, Kevin, then I'll go to Andy and Tom. All of you have mentioned different pandemics, smallpox, HIV, etc. My question is, polio, does that fit in the same category? I remember as a young boy growing up in Maine, we were all terrified of coming down with polio. We all lined up to take the serum, Dr. Falk's polio, not vaccine, but serum. And one of my friends in my neighborhood supposedly had polio. He was crippled. So, Kevin, would polio fit into this same category?
When I started looking critically at the field of being a deadly retrovirus, I initially thought in the 1990s it was just confined to this area of virology. They hadn't got it right. They hadn't done the proper controlled replication experiments, and indeed they hadn't. But I was thinking 20 years ago, this is just confined to this area of HIV. And as I researched the whole epistemology, it became very clear to me that this is a wider issue with not just the axioms of virology, but also the whole philosophy of allopathic approaches to healthcare and to what is health. And I think this whole critique of HIV that I came to in the 1980s and 1990s through basically the work of the Perth group, led by Eleni Papadopoulos-Eliopoulos in Western Australia, research that they did where they completely rebutted the HIV, the theory of HIV and there being a virus called a retrovirus called HIV. It completely rebutted that whole theory, and that so-called phenomenon was indeed oxidative stress, and the definition of AIDS as due to virus was completely rebutted by their work. That whole approach completely changed my understanding of not just what this phenomena HIV was, but also what other so-called viral diseases were. And I think with something like polio, there's so much evidence out there to show that there is no virus. What is called polio is to do with different epidemics of toxicity, different exposures, all sorts of other factors that have not been really shared with the public in the mainstream. And the whole epistemology of HIV that I came to understand in the 1990s has a wider application across all these concepts that we've been told are correct. These whole approach to health and illness based on concepts of viruses. And I think that's now what you're seeing is this whole area being unpacked now through citizen scientists like Mike Stone, space busters I've just come to recently. I've been brought into this whole area and being educated people that have got a completely different approach to this and no vested interest in the allopathic and the mainstream approaches. And I think that this is why you can't just question one viral disease. The analysis is applicable right across the whole discipline that's called virology, if it indeed is a discipline. The whole practice of virology is up for grabs and is questionable and is being upended daily. It's being overturned. And it's like the King Canute and the sea. It's actually receding in front of us as we talk. That's how I see it. So I think that this whole approach to what is health and the philosophy of health based on the concept of virus is now really going to be countered, is going to be defeated, it's going to be upended, it is being upended. And I think that people need to understand this. What they've been told by the public health authorities since the 20th century is completely wrong. It's false, it's fake. It's being shaped by vested interests that are biotech and big pharma and making profits for those industries. It's not about creating health. It's not about making people aware how to take responsibility for their own health. So I see polio, this so-called virus, this so-called viral disease that people were fearful of from before the Second World War and after the Second World War, is basically a shroud. It's a veneer that covers over multiple toxicities, all sorts of factors, nothing to do with the virus. And therefore, the idea of there being a serum or there being a vaccine. And that may sound very controversial to some people and very, very unorthodox. But I think that that is true. And I can point you to the evidence for it.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I am going to assume that Andy and Tom are going to agree with most of what you said, but you helped me transition to segue into the next topic when you talked about.
Regis, can I just bring up a few things about that?
Yep, go ahead. Go ahead, Tom.
So the first thing I would point out is, and I would encourage everybody to not believe me and go to your medical doctor and go to your public health authority and ask them a very simple question. Can you point me to the study that showed that polio was a transmissible disease? And I can guarantee you that essentially none of them will know. But the study was around 1907. And what they did was they took the spinal tissue of a child who had, they said, polio. They ground it up. They didn't purify it. They didn't look for a virus. They didn't find a virus. And they injected that right into the brain of two different monkeys. One monkey died and the other got paralyzed. They held the monkey up and they say, see, we transmitted the disease. Now, I don't know about you, Regis, but that doesn't sound like a science experiment to me because they didn't do any controls. That's not how polio allegedly is spread. And how do you know if you inject dead spinal tissue right into the brain of a monkey that alone doesn't cause trouble? The second thing I would say is if anybody can show me any paper showing anything that you could call a polio virus in any biological fluid of any sick person, I will recant everything I've been saying over the past 2 years because I can tell you that does not exist. All they did was change the diagnostic criteria before the vaccine. If you had to be, if you were sick, diarrhea, weakness, etc., it lasted for like a day or a week. Then you had polio. After they introduced the vaccine, you had to be paralyzed for 6 months or it wasn't polio. So the incidence went down from about 40,000 a year to about 300 a year just by changing the diagnostic criteria. And you can find very clear evidence that the history of polio is tied up with lead, arsenic, and DDT poisoning. And so we even have a very clear alternative explanation because both of those affect the anterior horn cells of your nervous system, exactly the place where we say the virus attacks. This is a very clear, easy to follow example. There is no virus. The vaccine had nothing to do with the changing the incidence. It was all about something else, just like Kevin said.
Wow, Tom, you know, and I'm speaking to all of my viewers. On the one hand, this is mind-blowing, but on the other hand, it's really frightening to know that for over 100 years, that everything we've come to believe from the healthcare industry, from the CDC, the WHO, the FDA, has been false. Andy, we're going to come over to you now for your thoughts on this.
Well, you know, I think polio is a really important example to look at because with respect to the, you know, triumph of vaccines, it's always held up as the primary example and, you know, called a miracle of modern medical science. However, if we look back to this, you know, there are many reasons why it's important. So firstly, the procedure that Tom and I alluded to of how they, you know, say that they found viruses was actually developed as a result of John Ender's technique to manufacture a polio vaccine. So that's how that kind of came to be a surrogate way to, allege that there is a new virus in existence, and that was for the polio vaccine. Now, we know simply from looking at the incidence of polio itself that its decline was not related to any vaccines because it occurred before vaccine was widely available. But it's also important to know that we're not saying that these illnesses or clinical conditions don't exist. I mean, certainly there were lots of people paralyzed from polio. We're just saying that the cause of it is not what it's declared to be. And in fact, if you look back at the data, there's a lot of solid evidence. It's not 100% conclusive, but that polio was caused by the use of various chemical pesticides, which were only first introduced actually at the time that polio began. And there's an excellent book on this called The Moth and the Iron Lung by Forrest Moretti. And it talks about how the gypsy moth was brought over to North America and became invasive. And for the first time, there was the idea of using a chemical to kill the pests because they were invading the fruit trees and other trees in the Northeast. And they began developing lead arsenate, which is a very toxic compound which has arsenic and lead in it, and they were using it. There was no regulatory agency at the time. There was no dosimetry where they said, oh, what dose is safe, what dose will kill the gypsy moths, that kind of thing. They were just kind of making this up in a extemporaneous fashion and doling it out and spraying it all over their trees, and without respect to thinking, oh, could this be dangerous if I got it on my skin, if I breathed it in, if I ate fruit from the trees that were sprayed with it, etc. But this practice became prevalent, and you saw the seasonal pattern of polio cases that children were primarily affected, and which makes sense with a toxin because since they're developing, they're more vulnerable to toxicity than adults. And it would occur in the summer months, right when they were tending to the crops and harvesting the fruits and other produce right from these plants that were being sprayed. And this kind of at some point transitioned from lead arsenate to DDT as being the pesticide of choice. And we've all seen those videos or photographs of children purposely walking into a cloud of DDT being sprayed because it was said to be beneficial. So, most likely these are the things that caused the paralysis and other neurologic symptoms that went along with that. And the story that we're told about the virus was simply fabricated for, a purpose of diverting us from the truth, perhaps. So it's very much a parallel to the recent situation with SARS-CoV-2, where it was, fabricated to get us to accept certain changes that really were to our own individual demise.
Well, I remember as a small boy growing up in a small town in central Maine that we had a mosquito problem. And, mosquitoes in Maine, some people say, are the state bird. They're huge. They bite, and it's not pleasant at all. But I do remember very distinctly they were spraying mostly the whole town, I think, with some kind of chemical. Nobody thought much of it in those days. They just thought, well, if it's going to get rid of the mosquitoes, it's got to be fine. And then some 30 or 40 years later, I was living in Arizona, and I saw frequently these biplanes that would fly over farms, vegetables, fruit orchards, and would be spraying this stuff. And, the wind was carrying that. You knew it had to go on top of people and on top of trees and plants and everything else. And I thought at that time, this has got to be really dangerous. So I'm really pleased to hear your explanations about viruses in general, but especially this polio quote unquote virus. It was basically caused by lead arsenic and DDT. Now, Andy, I want to continue with you, and I want to transition to what you've all been alluding to, that for over 100 years, the entire medical industrial complex has had it wrong. Andy, I'm talking now about everything from medical school to hospital care, nursing school. I'm talking about insurance companies. I'm talking about big pharma. I'm talking about the WHO, the CDC, the FDA, the WHO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Andy, what are your thoughts on this entire industrial complex we call the medical industry?
Well, that's quite a setup, and I could talk for several hours easily, or write a 3-volume book on this topic. I think it's important for people to realize that this all began really in earnest with a document called the Flexner Report, which came about in the early 20th century. And this was really a venture of the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan, and they had infiltrated and taken over the American Medical Association at the time. And the result of this report, which was studying medical education in the United States, and prior to that time, or at that time, most medical schools were teaching homeopathy and naturopathy, and for several years prior to that time, chiropractic had been gaining popularity, and it was very much compatible with those other types of medicine. And allopathic medicine was a small minority. In fact, in the 19th century, they were giving people things like medicines made of arsenic and mercury, even for teething infants. It's kind of interesting how they were doling out poisons even back then. But the Flexner Report essentially stated or concluded that allopathic medicine, which is our current model of, cut, burn, poison medicine, was the only legitimate way to go. And essentially what happened after that is there was a major change in the medical schools, that the number of homeopathic and naturopathic schools shrunk down to a very, very tiny number. And all of the schools that were going forward and were accredited through, various bodies were all in the allopathic model. And the pharmaceutical industry began to emerge out of the petroleum industry as a way to take petroleum products and use those to make health products at a profit. And that's really the start of the pharmaceutical industry. And the first product was called Nujol, or New Oil. And it was used as a laxative initially. It's still used, I think, in some laboratory preparations. And once the education system was reestablished and shifted, the members of those foundations essentially put board members on all of the medical school board of directors so that they could influence the further education. And we know that over time, the pharmaceutical industry has really infiltrated into the medical education and doing all sorts of things to, coerce and manipulate healthcare practitioners to favor their products and become a cog in the wheel. So essentially we have, if you look at this from a business model, what we have today is we have an explosion in the number of diagnoses of various chronic illnesses. None of them have a known cause. None of them have a cure, but they all have lots of procedures, devices, and especially pharmaceutical drugs that you can take not one time, but for the rest of your life, or repeatedly over the course of the rest of your life, and they will reduce your symptoms to make your incurable condition more livable. But in exchange for that, you are completely dependent. It's like a subscription model of the business where you keep paying more and more. You're guaranteed to pay for the rest of your life over time, rather than paying for a service, restoring your health, and then moving on with your life, which is more of how things work in nature. There's many other ways you can, analyze this because of all of the toxicity that goes along with it, and vaccines having special rules where they have no product liability, and we as the taxpayers, well, perhaps not myself, I may not be defined as a taxpayer, but the taxpayers have to actually pay the liability from the toxicity and danger of their products, and which gives them a special advantage, of course, just like all of the companies who made products related to this pandemic the last 2 years, right? Whether you sold surgical masks or PCR test kits or some other test kit or any other kind of PPE or vaccines or whatever, you're immune from liability because the government essentially gave blanket, immunity because of this emergency status. So this is how they can get away with, making so much money and not worry about being held responsible or accountable for the negative consequences of what they're doing.
Well, the cost of all of these products that were foisted on us has got to be, in the many billions of dollars, maybe even more. And I started thinking about this, where masks were everywhere. If you didn't have one, they probably had a box somewhere where you could take one and put it on. The PCR test, the numerous vaccines that were being foisted upon everybody. And I thought to myself, my goodness, somebody is making a lot of money off of this stuff. Tom, your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I would also point out that the healthcare industry, as you call it, or medical industrial complex, is not the only example of this. And I think, to me, the most important question people sometimes ask me, so Tom, do you think the healthcare system is failing? Or you think the public educational or any educational, they mean school system, is failing? Do you think the government is failing? And I actually say no. None of them are failing. Because in order to fail, you have to make a definition and become clear on what the intention of the system is. And it's very clear, just to take one example, that the purpose of our school system is to keep children from being educated. It's very clear. It's basically in their founding philosophy. The purpose was to create people who would fit into an industrial situation. And they've been at this for over 100 years, and they're very good at it and very efficient. And they know how to keep people from being educated. And so when you emerge from that system, you are basically uneducated. And that's the purpose of the school system. So it's very successful. The purpose of the government is to enslave you, basically. And they also have been at this for probably thousands of years, and they've become very proficient at it. And they have all different techniques, and they're very good at it. And so if you get involved with the government, they will enslave you more and more. Now, the purpose of the healthcare system is to keep you sick and to make you pay in a lot of money in this subscription model that Andy talked about. And of course, they always throw in a few things that are sort of mildly helpful. Otherwise, people would get pissed off and rebel. So you got to throw in a few, caveats every now and then. Like, you have to teach the children how to add a little bit so that the parents don't get all upset. And you have to give people Social Security checks and all that so they don't rebel. And so you have to do a few, setting people's bones and stopping bleeding. But basically, the purpose of the system is to keep you sick, keep you paying, keep you dependent on their system. And they've been at it for 100 years, as Andy points out, and they're good at it. They have various techniques of getting you into that model. And if anybody else there wants to be free, you have to see what the game is and decide you don't want to be part of any of these games, because they're all about keeping you uneducated, sick, and unfree.
Tom, you really make it very clear what it's really all about. You know, I was a high school teacher and coach back in the mid 70s, early 80s, and I've been an educator really ever since in various environments. And I've done a great deal of research on the history of American education. And a long time ago, I came to the very same conclusions that you did, Tom, that the entire system was geared to positioning people into certain environments where they were helpful to business industry, and profit making. And they were not taught to think critically, to think on their own. And this is, in my opinion, why I think maybe most of the people in the United States and several friends of mine are not able to see what you're saying and see through this scamdemic, see through the educational paradigm they've all been educated in, and understand why it is impossible for them to even listen to alternative explanations. It's an incredible insight. And the same thing has happened, as you point out, with the entire medical industry and big pharma. Kevin, we're going to come to you.
Can I just say one thing about what you just said? Because with all due respect, I'm going to suggest you change the word from an American educational system to an American school system. It's not an educational system. It's a school. They school you. And even if you look at the word, when you school somebody, you basically manipulate them. And there's no better person to read about this than my hero was Ivan Illich. And one of his favorite quotes, or my favorite quotes from him, was, if you do well in school, you get the dubious privilege of being able to consume more school until you've consumed so much school that the only people left that you can talk to are people who've consumed a similar amount of school. And that is basically the essence of virology.
I got to hand it to you, and I stand corrected on the terminology of education and being schooled. I'll be very careful to avoid that in the future, Tom.
All right.
Kevin, coming over to you for your comments on this topic.
Well, I think my comments would be very similar. But experience has been within the British system. The healthcare system has been one of, it's very much more state regulated in the sense that it's very much more controlled and what you call socialized medicine. But I think the lot of the axioms are similar. A lot of the basis of it's similar in that it's created a patient that is a dependent patient. It creates dependencies. It doesn't deal with cures. It creates dependencies, and it feeds those dependencies with drugs, chemotherapies, surgeries, radiotherapies, etc. Very, very toxic, and therefore it looks very negative. However, I think the positive side of it is that as much as it creates dependencies, the healthcare industry, and it feeds and it creates profits for vested interests like big pharma and biotech and etc., it has also created alternatives. Alternatives have emerged as a reaction to this. And I think that's the positive thing, is that there's so much critique now. There is so much dissent, massively now in the last 2 years. I mean, this is the real positive that I feel now. 25 years ago it was AIDS dissidents, and now it's everything's just accelerated. The alternatives, the unpacking, the deconstruction of things, what Anthony Giddens, a sociologist, calls radical doubt. We're living in the era of radical doubt, and that's a positive. People are doing it for themselves. They're going away from orthodox areas of expertise and orthodox experts and their own knowledge base upon which to build their own methods and their own deconstructive methods. And this is what you're seeing with citizen science. So I'm really hopeful that as much as the medical industrial complex, as you call it, which I think is a wonderful term, the medical and the industrial working together as a complex, as much as it creates dependency and hopelessness, it also, in response, there has arisen the opposite, hope and alternatives. And this is what will change what the sociologists of science call, the paradigm, Thomas Kuhn's paradigm changes. And paradigm changes are coming, if not underway already. What people like Stephen Cole have the frontier. We may be seen as fringe or on the edge of the mainstream, but the movement is growing, the critique is growing, the dissent is emerging, and this is what will overturn the orthodoxies. And there's always this fight, there's always this massive David and Goliath approach to things, and then suddenly it shifts and it moves forward all the time. So as much as I'm very negative about, especially today, where we've got this false Hobson's choice of COVID vax or repurpose bug killers like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and all the rest, repurposing or orthodox vaccination. You've got the alternatives, which is moving away from all of this, creating new paradigms of thinking and new choices, and moving forward all the time into an era where there is greater freedom, freedom to think, freedom to create new methodologies, and new great hope. I saw this 25 years ago. A lot of the HIV patients were given dreadful diagnoses and awful prognoses, and many of them moved forward. They even lost their HIV positivity. They changed their lifestyles, altered their toxicities, removed the toxicities from their lifestyles, and moved forward and are alive today because they didn't believe in this orthodox model that they were being pushed and shoehorned into. And I think that's what's happening today. That's what we're part of. And I think that's the greatest hope for the future. So that's what I think. I think the medical industrial complex is gone. It's going. It's destroying itself. As much as it looks powerful and it looks like a behemoth, it's not. It's actually the emperor's new clothes. And it's going to dissolve. It's dissolving. And we're moving forward through that.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for that hopeful note. I happen to agree with you that there's a significant paradigm shift taking place not only in the world of medicine and science, but also geopolitically. There are many people around the world who are aware, they can feel it, that things are not right with what's going on in the world, and that there's a new emerging paradigm, a new frontier, a new world that's emerging. So I want to thank you for that. Now, before we close, I'd like to give each of you one final shot. Is there something else that you would like to add? Andy, I want to come to you first.
Well, thank you so much, Regis, for really, opening up this forum to discuss this important thing. And to close, I want to actually follow up on something Kevin talked about, referencing Thomas Kuhn and the paradigm shift. And I agree that we are in the midst of this right now. And really, all of my efforts are focused on helping to create the infrastructure and true education for the new paradigm, because after all of the studying and experience that I have, realizing that the allopathic model is not really working for people, it's not compatible with how nature works. I realized that we don't have all the answers about what causes every health problem and what is the exact right thing to do in all those cases. But we do have this really rich body of information where we understand a lot of what causes disease, like we talked about with polio. And I'll tell you that it is toxicity that is the main culprit. And we also have knowledge, and this is through not only anecdotal information, but actually many, many published studies. Not every study in the scientific literature has erroneous conclusions like those in virology. There are some that are actually done properly and according to scientific principles and logic principles. And they lend quite a lot of information about how we can approach and help people recover from illnesses and achieve like real vitality. And this really can come about through individual men and women taking their own responsibility to find this information, that they would make a commitment to make changes in their life to bring about a better state of health. And so my efforts are focused on creating the curriculum, the body of knowledge, and not creating it, but collating it, assembling it, sifting through it, and bringing in other sources of this information who have value to offer. People like John Stewart Reed and Gerald Pollack and Dolph Zantinga and Eileen McCusick, and of course, Present Company and many other on our Virus Challenge team who have major positive contributions. And creating a forum and a library of a repository for all this information so that individuals out there can begin to educate themselves on the theoretical aspects, on the new breakthroughs in scientific discoveries, and also on the practical methods of how they can take their own health into their hands. So, like, for example, my alchemical detox course, which I just launched, will teach you essentially all you need to know how to heal, go through the steps to help your body heal from virtually any health condition. And so we need to shift into this area and bring about this new reality where individuals can be empowered to take control over their own health. They won't be held hostage by a system that's trying to profit from them, or in this day and age, really control them through surveillance and coercion. But they'll be able to be free and sovereign about the health of not only themselves, but their family. And once you have good health and vitality, you're able to achieve so much in your life. You're able to find that meaning. You're able to stand up against tyranny and injustice. So it's super important. And that's really my mission in life. And that's what I'd like to leave with the audience today.
Andy, thank you so much. I've thoroughly gone through all of your websites. I found them extremely helpful, informative, educational, and I will list your websites and whatever information you've provided to me about your study and your work in the description to the show. Tom, we're coming to you for a last comment.
Okay, thanks, Regis. And so first thing, thanks, Regis, for doing this. And it's very inspiring and courageous of you to allow this topic to be discussed. And so you deserve a lot of credit for that. And the second thing is I want to just give a shout out to both Kevin and Andy, who are incredible warriors in promulgating, searching for, and speaking the truth. And so without them and others, I wouldn't have gotten anywhere with this. I'm not sure I have gotten anywhere, but whatever. I'll be brief, because the only thing I really want to say to people is the only thing you really need to do is figure out how to know what's real, how to just commit to finding the truth and knowing the process of finding the truth. You may get it wrong. You may get sidelined and waylaid and false alarms and all kinds of things. But if you just commit to that, you will be amazed at what you will find out. Because I can assure everybody out there that the fact that there's no such thing as a pathogenic virus is the tip of the iceberg. Once you commit, the world will show you the next step and the next step and the next step, and you will end up living in a world that's much safer, much freer, much more joyful. You will be happier, healthier, more prosperous, and you will see a life that you couldn't have imagined in the situation you're in now. And all you have to do is just say, I'm going to figure out what's real, come hell or high water, and that's all I need to do.
Wow. Such tremendous insights from all of you. Tom, I really do think, and it's not just in the area of medicine and healthcare, but it's in everything. I had my breakthrough many, many years ago when I first began to question American exceptionalism, the spreading of freedom and democracy around the world. I've had the good fortune to travel around the world since 1968, all through Europe, in later years down through Asia, and most recently to Russia. And my journey has really been driven by the desire to find out for myself the truth. I have been challenged by people all over the world with this idea of American exceptionalism, the shining city on the hill. And I think that you're exactly right, Tom. It's the search for what's true, your own search, based on your own research, based on listening to people like yourselves in the area of medicine and healthcare, and the many others who are speaking out and searching for the truth on so many other levels in geopolitical issues that we're facing today in our world. Kevin, we'll come to you for a last comment.
Well, I would like to thank you very much, Regis, for allowing me to come on, to inviting me on, and it's a great honor to be on with you, and also with Andy and Tom, which I feel a bit of an also-ran really beside those two. But there we go. I would say my closing comments would be: don't be frightened to contest a thorough look all-powerful, like public health agencies, governments, and orthodox thinking generally. Think for yourself, think out of the box, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And as Andy said, or might have been Tom, I can't remember, I think they've both said this at times, but not every study, is badly run or badly designed. There are good studies. There are different types of research. Social science research isn't in the natural sciences. And so there's other forms of research. There's new scholarship coming out that's already there. Andy's part of this, Tom's part of this, all their publications, and all the others in this whole area that's erroneously called the no virus camp. I think really it's about critical thinking and thinking out of the box and looking at the material reality rather than some fictional, fictive, digital creation that bears no real resemblance. And I think that's what I would say that needs to happen, and that people are doing now very, very fundamentally. There is a shift happening. There are paradigm shifts in the making, already happening, underway, and things will never be the same again. We will never go back to what we had 2 years ago or 25 years ago. Things are moving forward all the time. So I think you have to shape the future. You can't just let it happen. You've got to be part of it, and you've got to create it for yourself and not allow others to take the responsibility away from you and to infantilize you. So those would be my closing comments.
Wow. I can't thank each of you enough. You know, this is the 287th video podcast I've done since coming to Russia in March of 2020. And I have to tell you, you have been three of my most treasured, valued guests. And I've had a lot on a lot of different issues. And I think that our conversation tonight was not just on the vaccine challenge, the medical industry, but the insights that you've shared with what each of us has to do on our own is to continue to search for the truth, to think on our own, to try to break out of the box and continue to search for the truth. I'm encouraged that each of you has offered hope to me, and I'm sure all of my viewers. Thank you again so much to each of you.
Thank you very much.